history books, Preston is commonly remembered for its Catholicism, and though its name dates back long before the Reformation, it's often said to refer to the number of priests that stayed in this area during that period. In the 16th century, it was described as a sink of popery, wherein priests were said to be lurking. In this short video, we're going to explore the prolonged history of Catholic resistance in Preston. We're going to look at how this came to bring events of national importance right onto the doorstep of the city, and explore the legacy that this has left for the city. We're going to explore several of the objects here in the Harris Museum and look at their place in the history of this city.
This story begins in 1527, when Henry VIII first requested a divorce from his wife Catherine of Aragon in order to marry Anne Boleyn. In what is a well-known story, the Pope could not and would not rule in this marriage case, and so Henry began the process of the English Reformation. This would allow him to rule in his own marriage case, and would therefore give him everything he wanted. In a series of acts passed in the English Parliament, England's religion was changed, and she became one of the few Protestant countries then in Europe. The effects of this came to be felt across the whole country, and particularly so here in Lancashire. During the dissolution of the monasteries, for example, the huge Cistercian house at Whalley was destroyed, and its abbot was executed for participation in a rebellion against the Reformation. After Henry's death, the Reformation continued and intensified under his son Edward, and by the end of the reign of his daughter Elizabeth in 1603, most people in England were Protestants. She had established an English church under a set of 39 articles, which specified that English parishioners would listen to the words of the gospel in their own language, and Englishmen no longer believed that the body and blood of Christ was actually present in the Eucharist. However, the story here in Lancashire was a little different. Lancashire was remote from the centre of power in London, and there was very little appetite here for Reformation. Many of the local gentry simply therefore refused to accept the new faith, and several prominent families would not convert. They often believed that the religion was not the business of the crown, and though they continued to support the monarchy, they did not support the new church.
Across the following 2 centuries, there were many examples in Lancashire especially of families who refused to adhere to Protestantism. This was illegal, and such families could be fined for their refusal to attend Mass at a Protestant church. For this reason, some families would go to church, just to avoid the fine. They would not participate in the Mass, they would not assent to prayers, nor would they take communion. However, this tacit refusal to participate in church services was not enough for many of Lancashire's Catholic families, and they accepted these recusancy fines. These families truly believed that the new faith was an heretical one, and that their souls would be damned with their participation within it. The names of these recalcitrant Catholic families appear in the recusancy rolls, which are lists of those who had to pay fines for their refusal to adhere to the new religion. Local to Preston were the Blundell families at Little Crosby, the Anderton family at Lostock Hall, the Sherburn family at Stonyhurst, the Townleys at Burnley, and the Southwood families at Salisbury Hall. It was illegal for priests to say Mass in England, and their practices had to be covered up. This meant that they were hidden from the local search parties who looked around this local area in particular, looking for priests. At Salisbury Hall, a priest hole is worked into the back of this fireplace, where a priest could have hidden during a search of the house. These were cramped and confined spaces that would have been incredibly unpleasant to reside in. The one at Salisbury Hall was constructed by the renowned Jesuit Nicholas Owen, who constructed some of the country's most elaborate priest holes before his execution in 1606. It is hidden behind this fireplace in the parlour at the house.
Using surviving inventories, we are able to piece together what was in a number of the chapels of these Catholic families. The chapel at Stonyhurst can be reimagined in particular detail because of an inventory of objects within it made in 1705. This can be examined now in the Lancashire Archives. This shows that Nicholas Sherburn owned many of the effects of Catholic worship. The walls were decorated with a black gilt leather, and there were several decorated chalices and crucifixes for use in the worship. One, for example, is described here as inlaid with mother of pearl, with a silver crucifix on top of it.
Another page of this inventory also lists the contents of the sacristy, a small room where a priest would have had to prepare himself for the Mass. As we can see, within this room there was a confession seat, another cross with a crucifix, and several embroidered vestments, the vibrant clothes a priest would have worn in his delivery of the Mass.
Catholic priests often made their objects for the giving of Mass portable and easy to hide away. There are several examples of chalices which could be easily screwed down and hidden. Priests, sometimes disguised as peddlers, would carry large chests with these objects in for the performance of Masses in the community. An excellent example of one of these objects used for the performance of secret Masses is the Horton Pyx, which is held now in the collections at the Harris Museum. It was found by a metal detectorist in Preston and is a small silver object used for carrying a consecrated host for use in the Mass. This example, which dates from around 1650, contains on one side the image of the crucifixion of Jesus, and on the other the Agnus Dei, or Lamb of God, which was a symbol of sacrifice commonly used in Catholic objects.
Looking at this tiny silver object, which at the time it was illegal to even own, it's hard not to imagine a scene in which a priest, perhaps running away or just forgetful, drops this sacred silver pyx.
Despite their reluctance to convert, many Catholics stayed loyal to the crown. Many felt that there was no conflict between their two loyalties, to the Church in Rome and the Crown in London. They were particularly attached to the Stuart monarchy, who ruled England after 1603. They hoped that these monarchs might offer them greater toleration, especially after Charles I was married to a Catholic. For this reason, at the outbreak of the Civil War in 1642, many chose to support the king and were incredibly proud to do so. William Blundell of Crosby was a Cavalier. He was a captain in the king's army and received a wound fighting for Charles that disabled him for life. Richard Sherburne also received wounds in battle and is remembered on his funeral monument as an eminent sufferer for the cause of the king. Many Catholics continued to support the Stuarts, especially after the conversion of Charles I's son James, who became James II after the death of his brother in 1685. When he was overthrown by the Dutch Protestant William of Orange, a number of Catholics continued to support his claims to the throne and refused to recognise the new king. They stayed loyal to James and were known as the Jacobites, after the Latin name for James, Jacobus. In the local area, members of some of the county's long-standing Catholic families turned to Jacobitism, and one historian of the movement has described Lancashire in the early 18th century as still the most Catholic and therefore the most Jacobite county in England. Nicholas Sherburne of Stonyhurst, for example, was a member of the Jacobite Mock Corporation, a social organisation set up in 1701, which met at the Unicorn pub in Walton Dale. Several objects connected to the movement are stored in this gallery in the Harris Museum. Here we have examples of the glassware they would have used to toast the king over the water, in what was a reference to the fact of James's exile over the Channel in France. We also have the ceremonial staves of the corporation, on which are engraved the names of its members. In the archives of the museum, the Harris also has the minute book of the Mock Corporation, which records the events of their meetings. From this, we know that the group elected a mayor and a town clerk, as well as the more humorously named custard eater and ale tester.
The mayor of the Mock Corporation in 1711 was James Ratcliffe, the third Earl of Derwentwater. He owned several estates in Cumbria and was one of the country's most renowned Jacobites. He had grown up with James II's son in exile and fiercely supported his claim to the throne. He had a connection to Preston and donated a ceremonial mace to the Mock Corporation, which is kept here in the Jacobite collection at the Harris Museum. The Earl of Derwentwater brought Jacobite matters to a head here in Preston in 1715, when he was one of the key figures in a rebellion against the King George I. Along with his brother Charles Radcliffe, he rose up in a rebellion designed to place James III on the throne. A number of Scots also participated in this rebellion and marched down in an army from Scotland in October. After a march through Carlisle and then Lancaster, they arrived in Preston on the 10th of November.
The details of the Jacobite rebellion have been researched by teams at both the Harris and the Lancashire archives. They've been able to piece together the events of the days after the 10th of November. We know, for example, that James III was proclaimed at the Market Cross, and that barricades were erected across the city, blocking access to some of the city's main streets. The Battle of Preston that followed was fought in the streets of the city between the Jacobites led by Thomas Forster and the Earl of Derwentwater, and government troops led by General Wills. As we can see on this map of the rebellion, there were several burnt houses at the bottom of Friargate, and horse and dragoons, commanded by Wills, paraded round the city. This was a close-fought battle, which was fought over several days, and the Jacobites enjoyed some initial success. The government had to bring in reinforcements, which brought about the final surrender of the Jacobites on Monday the 14th of November, 4 days after James had been declared king in the town centre. Negotiations for this surrender took place at the inn, which was then standing and named the Mitre. This building is now underneath the site on which the Harris Museum stands.
Around 1,000 Jacobites were imprisoned for several weeks in the Minster and were tried at a special commission set up in Liverpool. Several of the records relating to these trials are also kept now in the Lancashire archives. The Earl of Derwentwater was found guilty of treason, and despite protestations from his wife, he was sentenced to death and executed on Tower Hill on the 24th of February 1716. He was remembered as a hero of the Jacobite movement, and his death mask is preserved here in amongst the collection of Jacobite objects in the Harris Museum.
Many of the members of the Mock Corporation had been reluctant to join the Jacobite army in 1750. They had been more interested in preserving the social drinking society and the toast which came with it than they had with the idea of a violent insurrection. We will never know what might have happened had they joined in with the Highland rebels, but the outcome may have been different, and this might have profoundly affected the course of English history. The battle at Preston was the last battle fought on English soil, and it did much to secure the fate of the dynasty of George I. To celebrate the tercentenary of the rebellion, a trail was made around the city of Preston, which tracks the progress of the Jacobites. A map of this 30-minute trail is still available to download online. Despite the surrender of the Jacobites after the Battle of Preston in 1715, this was not to be the last time that the history of the movement would touch the city. In 1745, James's son, Charles Edward Stuart, would again come looking for supporters for his Jacobite army. Although a ball was held in his honour in the city, and though he was kept in the Bull and Royal on Church Street, he was to be disappointed. Very few of the town's Catholics were to rally to his army, and after 1715, the Mock Corporation had gone into relative decline. Charles was to be further disappointed in his march south, as when he reached Manchester, he also failed to gain recruits. Though he reached Derby, he turned round here and returned back to Scotland. On the 16th of April, he was defeated by the King's son, the Duke of Cumberland, at the Battle of Culloden. For many, this marks the end of the Jacobite movement. there was to be no further Jacobite rebellion in England, and the hopes of the cause died with the death of Charles Edward in 1788. I hope you have enjoyed this insight into the history of Catholicism in and around Preston. We have just scratched the surface of a history of resistance and rebellion which dates back to the Reformation. I hope also that you will now come and visit some of the collections here at the wonderful Harris Museum.